My father's birthday cake was still on the table when my mother stood up and said she had something to tell us. Not a toast. Not a memory. Something else entirely. She reached into the cardigan pocket she always kept things in, keys, a pen, her reading glasses, and she pulled out an envelope and she set it on the table between the half-eaten cake and my father's coffee cup, and she said, "I want you both to know what I've decided, while I am still here to tell you myself." My sister Karen looked at the envelope, then at my mother, then at me. I did not look at Karen. I looked at my mother, who was 73 years old, and had the specific, unhurried expression of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it and does not require anyone's approval to remain at peace.
She said the house was going to me.
Not to both of us. Not split.
To me.
Entirely. Karen's fork hit her plate before my mother finished the sentence. Welcome back to BetrayalLedger Stories, where family secrets never stay buried for long. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and join the family, because this story is one of the wildest ones we've ever told. Let's get into it. My name is Natalie Brennan. I am 37 years old. And the morning after my mother announced at my father's 75th birthday dinner that the family home was being left to me alone, my sister's attorney called at 9:47 a.m., and the conversation that followed lasted 11 minutes and changed the next 2 years of my life. Stay with me, because this story starts with a birthday cake and ends somewhere none of us expected. I need you to understand the house before I tell you what happened to it. The house on Elmwood Court in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, was a 4-bedroom colonial that my parents had purchased in 1978 when the street was newly built and the oak trees lining it were still young enough to be staked. 47 years later, those trees were enormous, their roots lifting the sidewalk in places, their canopy covering the street in summer in the specific, cathedral way of old trees on old streets that makes you feel like the neighborhood has been there since before anyone alive can remember. My parents had not just lived in that house. They had inhabited it in the complete sense, filling it with the accumulated evidence of 2 people who had been paying attention to the same space for almost 5 decades. The garden my mother had started in 1981 and had been adding to every spring since. The kitchen table my father had built in his workshop in 1985 and that had hosted 40 years of dinners and homework and birthday cakes. The particular smell of it in summer, wood and something floral from the garden, and the faint metallic coolness of the central air that my father had installed in 1993, and that still worked because he had maintained it every year without fail. My parents, Frank and Dorothy Brennan, had 2 daughters, me and Karen. Karen was 5 years older, which had always felt like more than 5 years in the specific way of sibling gaps that produce not just age difference, but personality difference, the older child formed by a set of circumstances the younger one never fully inherits. Karen had married at 26, moved 40 minutes away to a suburb of Dayton with her husband Leonard, raised 2 children in a house with a 3-car garage and a homeowners association, and the specific, comfortable life of someone who had made all the expected decisions in the expected order and had been rewarded for doing so. She called our parents on Sundays. She came for Christmas and Thanksgiving and the occasional birthday. She was not absent. She was present in the way that is sufficient for most purposes, and that falls short in the specific moments when presence that is merely sufficient is not enough. I had stayed. Not because I had failed to leave, not because my life was smaller than Karen's, but because I had made a different set of decisions that had kept me closer to Elmwood Court. I worked as a project manager for a construction company in Columbus, a job that suited me in the practical way that some jobs suit people when the work requires exactly the kind of attention they would be paying anyway. I had an apartment 15 minutes from my parents' house for 6 years, and then my father's Parkinson's diagnosis in 2019 had produced a conversation between my mother and me that resulted in my moving back into the house on Elmwood Court, into my old bedroom with the window that looked out over the garden, to help in the ways that needed helping. I need you to understand what that helping looked like. Not because I want recognition for it, but because the context matters for everything that comes after. For 4 years, I managed my father's medications and his appointments and his physical therapy schedule with the same project management attention I brought to my work, because it turned out that caring for a parent with a progressive neurological condition was in fact a project, one with a timeline and dependencies and a constantly shifting set of requirements that needed to be anticipated and addressed before they became crises. I drove him to Columbus Neurological Associates every 6 weeks. I coordinated with the home health aide, who came 3 days a week. I managed the modifications to the house, the grab bars and the ramp and the hospital bed that replaced the bed my parents had slept in since 1978, and I managed them in a way that preserved as much of the house's dignity as possible because my father cared about the house and I cared about him caring about it. Karen came when she could. She came for the holidays and for 2 of the neurology appointments and for one very difficult week in the winter of 2022 when my father's condition deteriorated sharply and then stabilized, and all of us were in the house together managing something that was too large for any of us to manage alone. She was present in that week in the complete sense.
I want to be clear about that.
She was not a person who did not love her parents. She was a person whose life had been built 40 minutes away, and 40 minutes is not far except when it is. My mother had watched all of this, quietly and completely, the way my mother watched everything, with the specific, unhurried attention of a woman who has been paying attention to the people she loves for 73 years and has become very good at understanding what she sees. She had made her decision before my father's birthday. She told me this later, that the decision had been made the previous November, sitting in the kitchen at the table my father had built. After a particularly hard day that I will not describe in detail because some things belong only to the people who lived through them. She had called Gerald Watts, who had been her attorney for 22 years, and she had told him what she wanted to do, and he had drafted the documents, and she had signed them, and she had put the signed document in the envelope that she carried in her cardigan pocket to my father's birthday dinner on a Saturday in March. My father's 75th birthday was a small dinner. Just the 4 of us, me and Karen and my parents, at the kitchen table with the cake my mother had made from the same recipe she had been using since 1987, carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The one my father had requested every birthday since before I was born. Karen and Leonard had come without the grandchildren this year because my father tired easily in the evenings and the children, who were 8 and 11, required a kind of energy that the dinner table could not sustain. It was a quiet dinner. A good dinner. My father was having a better day than most, which meant he was more present than usual, his attention less divided between the room and the internal experience of his condition. And we talked about things from the past the way people talk around a table when someone at it is 75 and has 47 years of memories attached to the room they are sitting in. When my mother stood up and set the envelope on the table, the dinner had been going for 2 hours. The cake was half eaten. My father's coffee was cooling in the cup he always used, the blue one with the chipped handle that my mother had been meaning to replace for years and had never replaced because my father preferred it. Karen was talking about something Leonard's company was doing, a story she had been in the middle of when my mother stood up. My mother said, "I want you both to know what I have decided, while I am still here to tell you myself." She said the house on Elmwood Court was going to Natalie, that her reasons were her own, and that she had thought about them carefully and discussed them with Gerald, and that the decision was made and documented and not subject to revision. She said she loved both of her daughters. She said that love and this decision were not in conflict in her mind, and she hoped they would not be in conflict in ours. Then she sat back down and picked up her fork. The table was very quiet. My father looked at the blue coffee cup. Karen looked at the envelope. I looked at my mother. Karen said, "I am sorry, what?" My mother said she had been clear. Karen said she did not think this was appropriate to discuss at a birthday dinner. My mother said she had chosen a birthday dinner specifically because she wanted her husband present when she said it, and that she thought 47 years of marriage entitled him to be present for the decisions being made about the house he had built a kitchen table for in 1985. There was nothing Karen could say to that. She did not say anything. She looked at her plate. Leonard, who had not been invited to this dinner because it was family only and who was therefore not present, was going to hear about this within the hour. I drove Karen to her car after dinner. The March evening was cold and clear, the kind of Ohio cold that lingers past the calendar's acknowledgement of spring, and the oak trees on Elmwood Court were still bare, their branches making their familiar pattern against the dark sky. Karen walked beside me without speaking until we reached her car, and then she turned and said that this was not over and that she intended to speak to someone. I said I understood. She drove away. I went back inside. My mother was washing the cake plate. My father was in his chair in the living room, the television on at the low volume he preferred in the evenings. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and then I went in and picked up a dish towel and dried the plate my mother handed me without either of us saying anything about what had just happened. Because some things do not need to be said in the immediate aftermath of their saying, and my mother and I both understood that. The call came the next morning at 9:47. I was in the kitchen with coffee, reviewing a project schedule on my laptop, when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Douglas Mercer, an attorney in Dayton. He said he was calling on behalf of Karen Brennan regarding the estate matter discussed the previous evening. He said his client intended to contest the proposed distribution on the grounds that it did not reflect an equitable division of the marital assets and that there were questions about the circumstances under which the decision had been made, specifically whether Dorothy Brennan had been subject to undue influence. Undue influence. That was the phrase. I sat with my coffee getting cold on the table and I listened to Douglas Mercer explain, in the practiced professional tone of someone delivering a message rather than a position, that his client was prepared to pursue this through the appropriate legal channels if a resolution could not be reached through discussion. I thanked him for calling. I said I would be in touch. I ended the call. Then I called Gerald Watts. Gerald answered before 9 in the morning the way Gerald always answered, with the unhurried precision of someone who has been doing this for 22 years and who had, I would learn in the conversation that followed, been expecting this call since the previous evening when my mother had called him after dinner to tell him how the announcement had gone. Gerald said, "Natalie, I want to tell you 3 things. The first thing is that your mother is of entirely sound mind and has been throughout this process. The second thing is that the undue influence claim has no factual basis, and I will be happy to document that completely. The third thing is that the document your mother signed in November is valid, properly executed, and has been filed with the appropriate county office." He said, Douglas Mercer is a competent attorney, but he does not have a strong case. I asked Gerald what happened next. He said what happened next was that he would send a response letter to Douglas Mercer's office that afternoon, and that I should let him handle the communication for now, and that I should call my mother and tell her what had happened so she was not surprised if Karen contacted her directly. I called my mother. She was in the garden. It was still too cold to plant anything, but she went out there in the mornings anyway, assessing the beds, planning the spring, doing the things gardeners do in March when they cannot yet do the things they are planning. She answered on the 3rd ring with garden dirt on her hands, I knew, because I could hear the particular way she held the phone when her hands were not fully clean. I told her about Douglas Mercer's call. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I expected this." I asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine. She said she had made her decision, and she had made it carefully, and she was not going to unmake it because Karen was unhappy. She said unhappy and carefully chosen were not the same thing, and she had spent 73 years understanding the difference. Then she said, "The tulips are coming up in the south bed. Your father will be pleased." Gerald's letter went to Douglas Mercer's office that afternoon. It was 12 pages long. It documented the timeline of my mother's decision, the consultations with Gerald, the circumstances of her mental capacity, the legal validity of the executed document, and a detailed accounting of the contributions made to the household and to the care of Frank Brennan over the preceding 4 years that was assembled from medical records and appointment logs and pharmacy receipts and the home health aides timesheets, all of which existed because I had been managing them and had maintained records the way I maintained records for every project, completely and in a format that was retrievable when you needed it. Douglas Mercer did not file a formal legal challenge. His response letter, which arrived 10 days after Gerald's, said his client wished to continue discussions about an equitable resolution. Gerald and I met with Douglas and Karen 3 weeks later in Gerald's conference room, a room that smelled like old books and the particular quiet of a space where important things happen without drama. Karen sat across from me for the first time since the birthday dinner. She looked tired. She had the expression of someone who has been told, by someone she paid for the information, that the case she had brought to them was not the case she had believed it was. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Gerald presented the documentation. Douglas asked questions and Gerald answered them. Karen said very little. At the end of the meeting, Douglas asked if there was a resolution my mother was willing to consider that would address his client's concerns about the equity of the distribution. Gerald had prepared for this question. My mother had told him what she was and was not willing to offer, clearly and specifically, in a conversation they had had the previous week. She was not willing to alter the disposition of the house. She was willing to offer Karen a larger share of the liquid assets in the estate, a recalibration that Gerald had documented in a proposed amendment that he slid across the conference table. Douglas reviewed it. He and Karen had a brief, quiet conversation that I did not attempt to hear. Then Douglas said his client would accept the proposed amendment. The amendment was signed 3 weeks later. Gerald filed it the same day. The house on Elmwood Court remained mine. Karen received a larger share of the financial accounts than she would have under the original distribution, which my mother had understood was a fair trade and which Karen understood. After 2 hours in Gerald's conference room with 12 pages of documentation on the table was the best available outcome. My father died in September. Quietly, in the hospital bed in the room that had been his bedroom for 47 years, with my mother beside him and me in the chair by the window that looked out over the garden. The oak trees on Elmwood Court were just beginning to turn, the first yellow coming into the edges of the canopy the way it came every year, exactly on schedule. My mother still lives in the house on Elmwood Court. She is in the garden every morning that the weather permits, and she sends me photographs of what is coming up the way she has always sent photographs, with the specific delight of someone who has been watching the same garden for 44 springs and still finds it remarkable that the tulips come back. I drive over on Sundays. I have coffee at the kitchen table my father built in 1985. The blue cup with the chipped handle is still in the cabinet. My mother uses it sometimes, not because she has forgotten to replace it, but because she has decided not to. Some things you keep because they are useful. Some things you keep because they are true. The house is going to be mine someday. My mother decided that at a kitchen table in November, in the specific, unhurried way she decided everything. And she put it in writing and she signed it, and she told us at a birthday dinner in March with a carrot cake on the table and the bare oak trees visible through the window. She had been paying attention for 73 years. It showed.